This is one that we saw in the queue earlier.
All
And
right, let's
wow,
do
we
it.
both get to this. This rarely happens here on the show, but it appears that we have an apologist on here. So Paul from England, how are you doing tonight?
Hi.
Hi, what did you want to talk about?
The about the fact that atheism appears to have a sort of burden of proof and an argument for God's existence.
Okay, let's start with why you believe we have a burden of proof.
Well, there are two forms of atheism. I called into the atheist experience a few weeks ago, but unfortunately I got cut off. Now, atheism usually is defined as the lack of belief in a God, or maybe that a person is an atheist if and only if they are not convinced of any arguments for God's existence. Do you reckon these definitions are fair?
Arden, where are you on this? What kind
I'm
of
going to repeat it
atheism?
back to you to make sure I understand correctly. But you said that you believe that atheism is either a lack of beliefs in gods or I mean that if that's the one you said, I think that's the one I heard you end with. That's the one that I would consider myself. I'm not convinced, therefore I lack belief.
Yeah, I would say that I'm in a similar boat, that I am not been presented with convincing evidence to conclude that there is a God.
Well, there is a difference between an atheist prior to evidence and after viewing supposed evidence, at least. An implicit atheist would be someone or like a rock or a newborn baby, a subject which has not yet viewed evidence, or at least isn't capable of processing evidence, and is just by default just lacking belief in a God because it hasn't really had the opportunity or doesn't have the capability of viewing the evidence. But the both of you, I would assume, are explicit atheists. In other words, you've already viewed people attempting to provide evidence, and you decided that the evidence that you've seen isn't compelling and doesn't work for whatever reason. So you remain lacking belief in a God slash gods. Is this fair?
Yeah, actually, that was really close. So we'll go with that.
Okay, so if explicit atheism entails lacking belief in God after viewing evidence, that means that explicit atheism involves the belief or the claim that the arguments that you've seen don't work, essentially. You must have seen the Kalam at this point. You must have seen many different arguments.
Yeah,
So
and as you said that, what was
atheism
running through my head was all the different arguments for the philosophical God, all the arguments for the resurrection, all those just went through my head, and I was just thinking about all of them and how I could actually say for all of those why I did not find those convincing.
Okay, so then if explicit atheism involves all those arguments being faulty, then that is a claim. In other words, you have to, in order to remain an explicit atheist, it entails those arguments being wrong. And to claim that an argument is wrong requires evidence. It's no different from you saying, okay, the moon is I don't know, made of cheese, and I say, okay, I disagree with your premise. I would still need to require evidence and to justify my claim. So if your view entails claiming that an argument is wrong, then it entails a burden of proof.
Well, see, now we run into a couple of problems with this. And I'll just tell you where I'm coming from, and we'll see if we can't find some way to meet in the middle. Because just because I cannot come up with a refutation, especially on the spot one, like in the form of a debate or a call, does not necessarily mean that I must accept the proposition that was given. One of the favorite examples I like to give is I don't have to know how tall a table is for me to know that the correct answer is not blue, right? So I can tell you why I don't find your answer convincing, okay? And with the myriad claims that they have out there, some of them fall very neatly into different categories. Like there's a lot of different ways to restate, for example, the ontological argument, right? But they're still going to fall on the same issues. So I kind of wonder where you're going with this, where it's up to me to refute every single claim. I would say that it's up to the person who's making a claim to do the convincing. And if they do come up with something, then you're right. I mean, it does deserve some sort of response to it. But even if I don't know the answer, that still doesn't mean that answer was correct, does it?
Yeah, but the thing is, okay, let's run this through. I, as a theist, make a claim about God's existence. Let's say the Quran. Let's say the first premise: everything that begins to exist has a cause. You, as a person who lacks belief in a God, has viewed this argument and disagrees with one or two of the premises or something like that, and you've remained a lack theist, we'll call it. So,
okay.
in order for you to have that viewpoint, you must have seen the evidence and then said, okay, well, this evidence doesn't work. So it entails being an explicit atheist. In other words, after viewing the evidence, entails that the evidence that you've been posited has some sort of fault. So it entails that it's wrong, at the very least. So in order to hold that viewpoint, it involves the burden of proof to actually be able to see why these arguments aren't compelling. I'm not saying that every time you say you're an atheist, you need to list all the arguments you've seen and say why they're wrong. I mean, that would be ridiculous. But I'm saying it requires actual argumentation. You can't just say that you can just sit back and say, okay, the theist has the burden of proof. I believe both sides are competing views. The theist may provide evidence. If you look at the evidence and you disagree with it, that's a claim. So if your viewpoint entails that claim that one or more of the arguments that you've seen are false, then your viewpoint entails a burden of proof for that claim. Every claim requires a burden of proof.
Right. And I think a lot of these common arguments have kind of been run through and debunked in a lot of different ways. So like I'm kind of trying to figure out where you're leading us. It feels like there's a destination and we haven't gotten there.
Yeah, what's the punchline? What's the conclusion here? Like we're agreeing with you. Like, you present something. Yeah, it does seem like it would be nicer if we did present not just crossing our arms and saying, "Oh, well, I'm still not convinced," but actually saying why we're not convinced. I get why that's a little bit more appealing in conversation and whatnot. But I suppose where I'm coming from is if we were to shift the burden of proof then to a person refuting the claims, there's a ridiculous number of claims that we can just put out there, right? And what are the reductio here is that anytime you are presented with a claim, you must accept it unless you can specifically refute it. Is that where you're going with this?
All I'm saying is that the burden of proof is on both sides. Even if you've been shown one argument for God's existence and it's an absolutely horrific argument, let's say Pascal's wager is seen as a pretty bad argument for God's existence. Even if you've just been shown that one and you say, okay, this is clearly wrong, even if your criticism is actually right, it's still a burden of proof that you've filled, that you've attained, in other words. So that would mean that your viewpoint, explicit atheism, in which you've already come into contact with evidence, would have a burden of proof, and theism would have a burden of proof.
Okay, I'm starting to feel that this is a bit of a sticky definition of the burden of proof, because burden of proof actually means something very specific, right? And when we say that the person who is making a claim, or like you to bring this to the courtroom analogy, it is up to the prosecution to prove guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, and the defense has to do absolutely nothing other than
on the plaintiff.
Yeah. So the defendant then just has to be, to say that the plaintiff did not meet their burden of proof, but does not actually have to present any specific refutation on that one. And this is a specific term that's used in a specific way, where you could you say something like, well, the defendants have to say why they didn't find this compelling in court? Technically, no.
No.
The
defendant isn't actually the one who decides. Okay, I can understand what you're saying. In the legal system, the plaintiff is the one who has the burden of proof. He or she is the one who proposes that the defendant has done something wrong. So that makes sense. But this isn't a fact of, in other words, the person who's judging here is the judge. So we ought to focus on the judge here. The judge is hearing evidence from the plaintiff. The judge says, okay, the plaintiff is making a claim. Does the plaintiff have evidence? And then after hearing the plaintiff's evidence, if the judge disagrees with the plaintiff, that would be an example of explicit atheism. In other words, after you've seen the evidence, you decide whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. And if you decide that it doesn't make sense, then your viewpoint involves intrinsically that all the evidence that you've seen doesn't make sense. And if that claim is intrinsic to your viewpoint, which it is, then it's also intrinsic to your viewpoint that you have a burden of proof, not necessarily to debunk every single argument you've ever heard the moment you tell someone you're an atheist, but merely to just have a justification in the first place. Isn't that the burden of proof? Isn't that atheist?
But the justification is that the arguments aren't convincing. Like, it feels like you're trying to lead us to this place where, like, if we refute one single argument in favor of God existing, that therefore we now have taken on the burden of proof and we have to prove that God doesn't exist, like, holistically, which seems really strange to me because we're working on like an individual argument basis. Like, I still feel like we're not at the destination you're leading us to.
So I would say, like I would accept the burden of proof to show why an argument isn't convincing to me, but then we have not shifted the entire conversation over to now it is now incumbent upon me to prove the initial proposition.
Right.
So so as long as we're dropping in at that.
I totally agree with that.
Okay. So I think one interesting way to do this is it says here that you have an argument for God's existence. So I think one way that we can demonstrate our position then is for you to give your argument, and then we'll show you how we react to it.
Mm.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that first, that the burden of proof isn't solely on the theist. Obviously, the theist is the one making the positive claim. So initially, they make they have the claim, they have the burden of proof. But an explicit atheist is intrinsically a person that has already viewed evidence and has reacted to it. So once you react to the evidence, if the evidence works, then you no longer have a lack of reasons to be a theist. And if it doesn't work, then you remain a lack theist. The only atheists that are let's say, safe from this rule, I suppose, would be like rocks or babies that can't.
Anybody who has not been presented with an argument for the existence of God.
Right.
I get where you're going with that. Yeah.
Let's just get to your argument. Yeah, that's what I'm interested in.
Let's get to the meat.
Okay. So basically, firstly, to do this argument, you have to. The first premise is essentially just the PSR. It's that everything that exists has some sort of reason. Not necessarily that we have to know the reason, but some sort of reason or explanation as to why it's there. This is the bedrock of philosophy and of science. And, not even like God can explain, can evade this. Even God would require a sort of reason or explanation for his existence. So that's the first premise. Would you agree with that?
I don't think so, but tentatively, let's move on to the next one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the second premise, more or less, I'm doing these premises off the top of my head, so it would be that that reality as a whole, not merely just this universe, but the entirety of reality exists and is either necessary. In other words, it explains itself. It explains its own existence, or it's dependent upon something else. So, in other words, contingent. So this is a dichotomy. Obviously, it has to be one of the two. The problem is the universe or reality can't be necessary because there are many different ways that reality could have been. For example, if we look at the most accepted version of the way people view reality, we look at the Big Bang models. There are multiple models that follow the laws that we have in science from different physicists. So there are clearly multiple ways that the universe could have been. And since there are multiple ways that the universe could have been, which is at least a part of all reality, then in order to say it's necessary, you run into the problem of the fact that it could have been different, and necessary things could have never been different. They are their own explanation, and they are the way that they are, and they couldn't have been any other way.
Okay, so let's take a pause here. Let's take a pause here. Arden, looked like you had something to say, and if you don't, I do.
I was just gonna say, like, so you're essentially saying, like, why is there something rather than nothing? Is that basically some of this premise, or like there has to be something or nothing, or there's nothing, basically?
No, it's what is the explanation of all of reality, or of all of the natural world.
How is that different from what I just said?
Well, the question of why there's something rather than nothing is like it kind of already like jumps to like it basically assumes that there's something that caused the universe, and why did it cause it? Why did it not cause it? I prefer to argue upwards towards a sort of explanation to the universe rather than assume it. I mean, that's the way I interpreted it. Maybe I'm wrong in that.
Okay.
Well,
let's just move
go,
on.
Arden. Go. Don't let me interrupt your train. Did you have more?
So
Arden?
more, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. There was just one more bit. So since the universe can't explain itself, then it requires some explanation, and more or less you would just describe that explanation as a god based on the fact that it's not dependent upon the universe. So
And there's the problem.
Material.
Okay, right there, Lucas. Or Paul, I'm sorry. I called you Lucas by accident. Paul, and there's the problem. And there was that big punchline. And this is why all sorts of arguments for God, from the Leibniz cosmological argument to the modal ontological argument, all fail. Because what you're doing is you're taking the logical progression, you're getting to the end of it, and you're saying, oh, that would be God. Like whatever this is at the end of it, we're gonna put the label of God on it. On Cameron Bertuzzi's website, on Inspiring Philosophy's website, there's this moral argument. It said that the grounding for morality must be bigger than something in humans, and then it says at the very end, whatever this grounding is, we call that God. So what it's sounding like is you're taking these definitions and these logic progressions, and then you're saying, okay, fine, God, without any sort of way to demonstrate that this God actually has the characteristics that you were trying to assign him.
Should I explain why it does?
It hasn't happened in years, but go ahead and try.
Well, considering the entirety of reality would be based upon this thing, the entirety of the natural world, at least, so nature, so just like the universe or maybe multiverses or whatever. Since we are kind of talking about things that we haven't really searched and gotten to, we can say at the very least that this thing would not rely on time, space, matter, or... No.
We can't say that. We cannot say something like, we don't know anything about this, therefore we can go ahead and make some assumptions about it. You either don't know anything about it, or you do know something about it. And if you do know something about it, it's going to require some sort of demonstration. We're not just going to take it as, well, it must have these properties. Actually demonstrate that there is something that has these properties, and then we'll talk.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, that wasn't exactly what I said. I said we haven't gone. Basically, what I meant was we haven't quite gone beyond our observable universe.
Okay.
And so.
Since we haven't done that, forgive me, we got to start taking this one question at a time, because otherwise it's going to go into rabbit holes. But if we haven't even done that, why would we put any more coats on that particular coat rack? Like, let's get this first, because you're talking to a pragmatist here who, I don't want to build the next level of the house until this level is nicely built. We got the foundation for this, then we can start building on the next level. Okay, because what's the next level after this? Well, if this God is real, then it must be Christianity, and if it's Christianity, then it must be Calvinism, and then you're going to start building these layers and layers and layers when you haven't even gotten that foundation. Demonstrate that the God that you're thinking about has the properties that you say it does.
Okay, yeah, I was in the middle of doing that. At the very least, we can say that reality contains the universe, and the universe is time, space, matter, and energy.
Okay,
since
that,
this
do
thing
you
is not
see that
dependent-
you're not actually, we're asking a very specific question here. This thing that you're talking about that is the foundation or of your belief of whatever you're putting God on, demonstrate that that actually has the qualities that you are saying it has, not just through logical argumentation, but actually demonstrating that what you think is doing it is doing it.
Yeah, I'm arguing for a thing that's timeless, spaces, and immaterial. In order for me to do that, I need to explain that the entire reality is that the entirety of reality is dependent upon this thing, and at the very least, we know that the universe is in reality. And since the universe is time, space, matter, and energy, I'm justified in saying that this thing is timeless, spaceless.
Again, I could grant all that, and we still have no idea that what you are talking about has the property of timeless. How do we test timelessness? How do we determine that what you're thinking of has the property timeless? I don't want you to think that it seems like we're coming up on an impasse here, and it's about 20 minutes into the call. I hope that we at least have shown you that based on your first part of the conversation, that we are not just shrugging this off. We are telling you exactly why we do not find this argument convincing. So yeah, I agree with you on that first point, where we can't just, at least it's not conducive to good conversation to just cross my arms and say, I don't buy it. So, but we're telling you, like, using an argument here, we can actually tell you why it's not convincing to us. Now, are we right? I don't know.
I understand that.
Are you right? I don't know.
I can explain why. Okay, then I'll explain why it's personal. Then, on top of all that, which pushes it even closer to God. I'm going to let you give your argument for a personal, but then we're going to have to take this somewhere else. If you would like to interact with us on our Discord, please do so, because there's a lot of people who like to have these philosophical conversations. Philosophy is my weak point. So you're kind of jabbing me right where it counts right now. But give this, and then we'll give it why, and then we're going to have to call it a night because we do have other calls we need to get to. Why is this God personal? If I was to, considering the fact that this thing would be necessary because it grounds all contingent reality. If it wasn't necessary, then the universe would be eternal. But the fact that the universe isn't eternal.
How do you know the universe is
right? Where are you getting this? Where are you getting this?
Getting what? That the universe is eternal, is not eternal.
Yeah, where are you getting this?
Well, because it is dependent upon something else, so it can't exactly precede that thing. So therefore, it must be limited in its past.
Oh, the infinite. Okay. Well, going along with that, keep going as to why it's personal and exactly what you mean by personal.
By personal, I mean it's capable of free will. It's capable of choice. The reason why that's the case is because there are two options. Either this thing is conscious or it's unconscious. If it's unconscious, then the universe would be eternal. We can see that the universe isn't eternal. So there's a gap in time in which this necessary thing exists and the universe does. So the only way that's possible is if this thing essentially. Okay. Well. Okay,
Arden, you want to take this one?
Essentially, just made.
I don't see how you can assert that these things are linked in any way. Consciousness, lack of consciousness, like it's eternal, but it's also timeless. Like I don't know. These things seem to be in some way like mutually exclusive. But like I don't know. Fuck.
No, I get it, and where we're coming from here is you're not presenting a case where we can look at this and say that the evidence is lining up in this way, and the questions that we have are not being addressed in the way that we would need these questions to be addressed. Is that a failing on our part? Maybe. Is it a failing on the? Is it a failing on the case made by the prosecution? Definitely. Okay, but now the problem is if you're going to try to get me to buy into whatever this is, it's going to have to be a case that's convincing to me, and I need to be convinced in a way other than well, it couldn't be this because of some definition. What's this telling me is that we don't have enough adequate understanding of the nature of our universe, and we don't have the language to describe it. And by using the limited kind of language that we have and the limited kind of logic we have,
you're thinking
Paul,
scientifically.
Paul, Well, I will absolutely continue this conversation with you in Discord. We got to move on to other things, but hopefully we've let you know that we are not just sitting here and shrugging it off. We are actually taking these arguments to heart, listening to them and engaging with them. I do have to keep this conversation going and keep the show going, but if you would please get in touch with us on our Discord, go in there and keep the conversation going with me. I'm Puck on there. You can find me there pretty much every day. I appreciate the call. This was our very first apologetics call for both of us. So this was a wonderful conversation. We appreciate having it with you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. That was refreshing. That was actually kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like you know, I do calls on trans stuff literally all the time, so that's old hat for me. I literally never, my brain is already like pre-rolling every single counter argument to what people are saying by the second a call comes in. I've had these I talk to myself having these arguments, but I mean, with the precept stuff, that it just like there was first, at least for the sake of argument, at least within like internally, I was following the argument, and then there's just like a lot of assumptions that get made and jumps to like assuming things about the universe and assuming things about the quality of this.
And then my favorite punchline at the end, whatever this is, we're gonna call it God. And since we use since they use the same word here in this particular book, we're going to assume that they're talking about the same thing.